Should political deepfakes be a form of protected speech? Yes. People who use AI still retain their First Amendment rights, and that's because AI is an expressive tool. It helps people communicate. It can do so by editing, by generating ideas, all of it that it can do, particularly when we're talking about generative AI, is a form of expression that's created by a user prompting the AI machine to help it generate this content. So just because AI is used doesn't mean that someone loses their First Amendment rights, like the right to share information or the right to receive it. So when we're talking about political deepfakes, we're even talking about a more niche area that receives traditionally higher protection. And that's because the First Amendment is founded on the idea of that we have multiple political factions in the United States, and they need to receive protection when they're not in the majority. So the First Amendment protects people from government influence over their political views. Just because you're using AI or the printing press or posting on social media doesn't mean you receive lower amount of free speech. In fact, we need to protect those areas even more because they allow us to communicate at a greater capacity. Printing something or publishing it means that you're getting your information out much broader than just talking in a public square, for example. Social media and just the internet in general allows people to publish and get their names out there to a much broader extent, and more so than we've ever seen in history. That absolutely needs to be protected. AI lowers barriers to allow people to engage in better communication faster and cheaper than we ever have before. So what areas can be regulated, or at least what areas have been regulated so far? My argument is existing law already covers areas like defamation and fraud, and we do not need new laws to protect people from harm. And that's what we're talking about here. When false speech is paired with harm, you have potentially a claim that receives less First Amendment protection. So in the area of defamation, which requires a false statement of fact, publication to a third party, and that the speaker is at fault for having at least negligence when it comes to an ordinary everyday person that they're talking about, that they're negligent regarding the truth or falsity of their statement. Now, if it's a politician, this standard is much higher. It's called actual malice. It's a test that was developed in the Supreme Court case, New York Times v. Sullivan. In that case, the person needs knowledge of falsity or reckless disregard for the truth. That's the third element. The fourth element, which I talked about earlier, is actual harm. So did the statement cause reputational harm or economic injury or other damages? This is the basic test for defamation. If you hit all four elements, you could have a claim. Again, the Supreme Court has already worked out how the First Amendment fits in with this and where someone can receive compensation when their reputation has been harmed. Now, the second category, generally speaking, is fraud. And the elements of fraud include a false representation of material fact. So the fact has to be an important one. Knowledge of the falsity. So the defendant needs to know that the statement was false or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. They must have an intent to induce reliance. So the statement that was made must cause the person to act or refrain from acting. And the person that relied on it must have justifiable reliance, meaning the person actually relied on the statement and that the reliance was reasonable. And then the fifth one, again, is the harm aspect, and the person must have suffered harm as a result of relying on the misrepresentation. Again, if someone can prove all five elements, someone might be in trouble for fraud. Now, fraud, generally speaking, fraud can be a criminal statute. I think you can have civil claims as well for fraud, but in general, Defamation is more of a civil suit. Fraud is more of a criminal statute. In either case, you need some sort of intent for both, and you need that harm element. That's what separates these narrow categories of unprotected speech from general false speech. So I'll leave you with that. Political deepfakes are protected speech unless they fall into one of these narrow categories. Core political speech is a traditionally highly protected area of speech because it's so foundational to our self-governing society, and that narrow categories of unprotected speech like fraud and defamation are areas in existing law where someone can be in trouble for making false statements. Have a good day.